Hello everyone, this is part 7 of What If Naruto Was a Prodigy and in the Anbu, and I hope you guys enjoy this video and to like, to subscribe, to see more comment down below. Now let's start the intro.
They call me a god. They call me a god. They call me a god.
Senju Tsunade had only been there for 2 days and already things were beginning to look up. The third Hokage was up on his feet, most of the debris had finally been cleared and the village lockdown had been lightened. The Sannin stayed for a few more days and then a week, and then it didn't seem like she was going to leave at all. After the Crater City incident, Tsunade hadn't said more than 2 words to Naruto. She, like many others, had been working. While she had been there, she had attended to the Hokage, restructured hospital wards and theaters, because when a grumpy S-rank shinobi tells you to do something, you usually do it, and provided expert care for the remainder of shinobi still in critical condition. With her arrival, the final death toll was known. 683 were dead. A third of Konoha had been destroyed in the Blitz. Although that number only accounted for roughly 5 or 6% of Konoha's armed forces, when combined with the number of those injured and unable to complete missions, it effectively meant that Konoha had lost 10% of its strength almost overnight. It was a tremendous blow, one that had severe implications on the short-term recovery and their long-term status as the most powerful hidden village in the world. The Hokage had barely been up for a day before he disappeared behind locked doors, attending meetings and consultations with a wide group of men and women. Representatives from the village hidden by a waterfall and the village hidden in grass met with the Hokage, no doubt talking about securing their side of the border against any possible movement from the land of Earth. The daimyo of River County had visited the Hokage as they negotiated over lifting tariffs for incoming support from the land of Wind. Iwa, Kumo and Suna had all expressed their regrets over the terrible incident that had occurred and promised their support, but only Suna could really be counted on as one of Konoha's long-term allies. Relations with Iwa were professional but little else, and it was an open secret that Kumo wanted to replace Konoha as the most powerful village in the world and would probably offer nothing but platitudes. The Hokage was extremely busy. Uzumaki Naruto, codenamed Ferret, assigned to Sigma Squad as the Hokage's personal aide, was probably the only other shinobi in the village who worked as hard as their leader did during the month after the Blitz. The Hokage had said nothing to Naruto about Tsunade's timely arrival, but Naruto knew that the old man knew, and the old man knew that Naruto knew that he knew, and there was probably some more underneath stuff in all of that. Naruto had resolved not to say a word unless the Hokage brought it up first, and so far the third had been far too busy to do anything of the sort. At the moment, he stood behind Sarutobi as the Hokage puffed on his pipe, occasionally letting out a noise that was probably interpreted as a sympathetic murmur but, as Naruto knew from experience, was more of a grunt of annoyance. Light spilled in from the windows as the team 1 from ANBU's Alpha Squad hid in the shadows, extra protection against all the foreign dignitaries and visitors entering the village. This time, it was a tall, thin man with extremely pale skin and pinkish-red eyes. White hair spilled from his cap and his teacup rattled in his hands as he pushed his case to the Hokage. "I understand, Ambassador Basho," the Hokage murmured as the man paused to take a breath. He held up a hand, preventing the man from the land of hot water from speaking. "But, given our circumstances, we cannot afford to send an entire division to guard a border that has been peaceful for the last 17 years. You know what Kumo is like." Ambassador Basho protested. He was sweating, Naruto realized. "They will have undoubtedly sensed your weakness, and we both know that they don't like having the land of hot water acting as a buffer between the lands of fire and lightning. They might move in our territory while you're weakened. They could, but I sincerely doubt it. My information sources are usually impeccable and they have alerted me that Kumo's interests lie elsewhere," the Hokage concluded confidently. He made a tiny motion with his hand and Naruto walked to the other side of the table. "Now, I'm very sorry to conclude our session, but I have another appointment." The ambassador squinted up at Naruto's masked face, looking decidedly unhappy as the blonde-haired Anbu gently but firmly directed the man away from his chair and towards the door. He opened it, nodding to the Jonin escort behind him. Ambassador Basho left the office, looking decidedly unhappy, and Naruto turned back to the Hokage. As soon as the door shut, Sarutobi slumped in his chair and rubbed his face wearily. "That man," the Hokage mumbled in an exasperated tone, speaking to nobody in particular. If they were truly worried about national security, then they shouldn't have dissolved their hidden village. Naruto busied himself making a cup of steaming tea for the Hokage while the old man took the brief respite to have a rest. These constant meetings were tedious on the both of them, and when Naruto turned around, Sarutobi's head had dipped and he was snoozing. The Anbu carefully placed the cup of tea in front of his leader and pulled out the next manila folder on the pile. He opened it, studying the appointment schedule carefully. "We have a meeting with a dignitary from the land of frost," he informed the apparently snoozing Hokage. "They haven't given us a topic but." Sarutobi let out a loud snore and Naruto paused. The Hokage's hat had fallen down over his eyes and a little trail of drool was leaking from one side of his mouth, his pipe dangling uselessly on the other. The cup of tea sat in front of him, unattended, as steam rose from its surface. "Hokage-sama," he called loudly. Sarutobi shifted in his seat, muttering something unintelligently, and Naruto sighed. He put the folder down and clicked his fingers. Almost instantly, a Chunin messenger appeared in the office, bent down on one knee and waiting for instructions. "Tell the rest of them that Hokage-sama is not taking any more visitors," Naruto told the prostrate shinobi. In a body flicker just as good or better than anything Naruto could produce, the Chunin messenger disappeared and Naruto frowned, his arms crossed. "All right, there," he said snappishly. "There are no more bad meetings. You didn't have to fake a sickie to get out of it, you know." He turned back to the Hokage, was not surprised to see him calmly sipping his tea. "Ah, excellent work, Ferret," Sarutobi murmured. "I had the most refreshing of naps." "Yeah, in the 7 seconds you lazy," Naruto was muttering something sarcastic under his breath and as such unprepared for the heavy tone that struck him in the head. He let out a cry of dismay as he was propelled to the floor, Sarutobi glaring at him from behind his desk. "I wanted 3 sugars," he snapped. "Take what you can get, you old codger." Naruto snapped back, rising to his feet. "And stop abusing your aid. I'm the Hokage, I can do what I want," Sarutobi thundered. From behind his mask, Naruto made a face as he picked up the book that the old man had just lobbed at him. "And stop making faces." Naruto froze, grimacing. He put the book away, sighing mournfully, and approached the Hokage's desk. There were piles of neat and tidy paperwork all over it, and barely any the table was actually visible. Naruto picked up a folder from the first pile and began to survey it carefully. After a few moments, he signed the bottom and placed it on a new pile. This continued on for a while, the Hokage quietly supping his tea and Naruto worked diligently through the stack of forms. There was nothing overly major in them, just some logistical requests for the rebuilding of residential sectors of 13 to 18, and the Hokage was happy to allow his assistant to complete the work in his stead. After a while, the Hokage finished his tea and stared contently out the window at the somber faces of the Hokage's monument. Naruto finished a stack of paper and clicked his fingers. Chakra pulsed, activating one of the transmission seals located in the office. It sent a signal that lighted up its receiver, a blinking yellow light in the communications office, and a messenger was there in an instant. "Take this to the missions assignment desk, please," Naruto ordered, unloading the stack of paperwork in the poor man's arms. "Then take this," he placed a scroll in the top pocket of the Chunin's vest, "to the Nara clan house for Nara Shikaku." "Yes, sir." The messenger bowed his head and disappeared with the stack of papers in his arms. Naruto turned back to the table, idly pondering which stack of papers he would tackle next. The sun shone down through the window and a nice breeze blew into the room. Sarutobi seemed content to laze in his chair as Naruto started on a new stack of work. A puzzled expression crossed his face as he read one of them, pausing in his work to go and consult a thick tome on the bookshelf, then came back and firmly denied the request. As he was working, there was a polite knock on the door. Naruto looked up, a frown on his face, and a Jonin entered the room. He wore a green bandana across his head and appeared to be sucking on a senbon. "Excuse me, Hokage-sama," he drawled, looking completely unconcerned at his interruption. "Tsunade-sama is asking if she oof." Tsunade hadn't even waited for the man to finish before she barged in, her apprentice trailing behind her. The Sannin was scowling fiercely as she confronted the Hokage. The old man's hat was covering his eyes and he was snoozing rather unconvincingly. She paused in her step, her golden eyes raking over Naruto, and a curious little smirk crossed her face. Naruto held back a sigh and waved the Jonin away. He nodded, looking pretty amused, and closed the door. "Oi!" Tsunade barked at the Hokage. Her arms were crossed and she looked unimpressed by the old man's little nap. I know you're not really sleeping, so unless you wake up. The Hokage suddenly snorted, his head rising. He grunted, moving his hat and blinking rather blearily. His eyes came to rest on Tsunade and he blinked. Oh, hello. Sarutobi greeted rather enthusiastically. He looked puzzled. Were we scheduled to have an appointment today? I can't seem to recall, he trailed off. Tsunade snorted as she took a seat opposite of the Hokage. Her assistant came to stand behind her, but she kept staring at Naruto as the Sannin and the Hokage began to talk about introducing new hospital safety procedures. Naruto only half listened as he was drawn into a staring contest by Tsunade's assistant. From what he had heard, her name was Shizune and she despised him. Apparently what Naruto had done to Tsunade had left a bad impression on the older Jonin. He had only encountered her briefly, no more than a few minutes at a time as he went about his duties, but every time he had seen her she had been glaring at him angrily. This time she wasn't holding her little pig and continued glaring at Naruto as he put down the paperwork and went to stand behind Sarutobi. Ah, yes, Sarutobi murmured. He gestured at Naruto. Have you met Naruto yet? Tsunade's eyes came to rest on him and she slowly smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. Yes, she answered simply. Yes, I have. There was much unsaid in her sentence, but Sarutobi apparently didn't pick up on it as he nodded genially. Excellent, he said, practically beaming. He's my apprentice, you know. I'm actually quite proud of him. He's an excellent shinobi, adheres to the will of fire and works extremely hard when attending his duties. I couldn't ask for a better apprentice. Oh, Tsunade cocked an eyebrow. She gestured at Shizune. And have you met Shizune before? She's my apprentice, Tsunade stressed, giving Sarutobi a rather significant look. She also works hard and is one of the best medics I've ever taught. She's definitely earned her Jonin rank and saved countless lives. Both Shizune and Naruto preened under their mentor's words. Sarutobi was still smiling but his eyes narrowed imperceptibly. Then they have something in common, Sarutobi said lightly. Did you know that Naruto here delayed the second invasion of Konoha? After that, his team single-handedly encountered the enemy leader and destroyed the weapon that was going to destroy Konoha. He's to be praised, indeed. Tsunade put back hands on the table. Well, Shizune just spent a week healing over 100 shinobi. She counted, her voice beginning to rise. What's more, she's also reorganized the hospital storerooms and volunteered her services in the children's ward. Naruto's smile had frozen behind his mask and Shizune looked very strained as their mentors glared at each other. Naruto can make tea. Sarutobi countered. Shizune can wash clothes. Tsunade growled. He washes the dishes and gets Konohamaru ready for training. She looks after Tonton and fetches my booze. He does my work. She lets me sleep in. The two were glaring at each other, their hands on the table as they leaned forward. Shizune looked like she was despairing and threw a dirty look at Naruto, whose mouth dropped open. He silently pointed at himself and shrugged. How was it his fault? Shizune ignored him as she gently placed her hands on Tsunade's shoulders and tried to calm her down. Naruto gritted his teeth and quickly picked up Sarutobi's pipe. He filled it with tobacco and presented it to the Hokage, who snatched it away and popped it in his mouth. At the same time, Shizune had presented a flask from somewhere and Tsunade took a gigantic swig of it, swallowing a mouthful with an audible sigh and wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. Both assistants sagged in relief as the tempers of their respective mentors seemed to die down. How about a little challenge then, Tsunade? Sarutobi suddenly mentioned as he puffed on his pipe, your apprentice against my own. Tsunade frowned. Naruto and Shizune stiffened. We could, of course, make a small bet on it. Those were the magic words and the Sannin's eyes lit up greedily. She took another sip of the flask and leaned back on the chair, her green jacket flapping and falling away, exposing some of her cleavage. Naruto tried very hard not to stare too hard as Sarutobi beamed. What are your terms? Tsunade asked confidently. Whatever they are, I'm sure Shizune can handle them easily. Shizune looked like she doubted that, but one look at Naruto seemed to strengthen her resolve and she gave her younger counterpart a challenging look. Naruto just shook his head at the stupidity of it and crossed his arms, determined to stay out of it. Seem as how it's almost lunchtime, what do you say about having our lovely apprentices here go and fetch us a meal? Sarutobi suggested. He puffed on his pipe, sending a cloud of smoke billowing into the air. We can give them, say, 10 minutes to make us our lunches. The best lunch, naturally, wins the contest. Sounds dumb, Naruto deadpanned rather loudly. I'll do it, Shizune said at exactly the same time, making a fist. Well, she's already beating yours on attitude. Tsunade smirked. She leant back in her chair. Still, what more could you accept from a little brat like him? He doesn't look like he makes a very good apprentice. Are you sure you made the right choice? Naruto twitched at the rather obvious use of emotional blackmail. He shook his head despondently and didn't say anything else. Sarutobi seemed to take that as a sign that he had agreed to participate and nodded. Very well, then, the Hokage said. He clapped. Off you go, then. I'm very hungry. Shizune bowed, while Naruto was just shaking his head. Together, they walked towards the door and out of the office. Naruto sighed as the door closed behind them and turned to look at his counterpart. She was staring at him rather determinedly, the challenge blazing in her eyes. Naruto narrowed his eyes and stared back. A fierce blaze of determination began to seep into his body as he clenched his fists. Oh, it was on. For a moment, both apprentices were still. Then, in a flash, they were moving. Naruto felt a pang of surprise as Shizune launched forward with incredible speed, moving much faster than he had been expected, and he struggled to keep up with her as they dashed down the hallway. Other shinobi and well-dressed men and women cried out and flinched as the two apprentices came bolting around the corner. Shizune was gritting her teeth as she dodged and weaved through a crowd of unaware obstacles, her medic nin evasion training assisting her, while Naruto merely leapt to the roof, flipped upside down and bounded over them. Shoulder to shoulder, both puffing loudly, they turned the last corner and approached the kitchen doors. They burst through them with ease and wood splintered as the doors were knocked off of their hinges. Luckily, the kitchen was empty and Shizune immediately grabbed the nearest available bench. Naruto took the one next to her and they pushed and shoved one another on their way to the fridge. The door was yanked open and both apprentices grabbed whatever they could, leaping back to their benches and dumping everything down. Naruto's hands were moving as a blur as he chopped a lettuce and sliced a tomato in seconds. He grabbed a wrap while throwing up a block of cheese. It soared into the air, slowed and then began to fall. Naruto had already lined the wrap with the salads. Something glinted in his hand. The kunai blurred through the air as Naruto sliced the cheese expertly, allowing it to fall on his wrap. He grinned, throwing a look at Shizune. Shizune ignored him as she finished putting a plump cherry on top of the icing. Naruto gaped at the frosty cake that she had somehow conjured in the last minute as Shizune threw him a triumphant look. They said lunches. Naruto protested loudly, his hands still blurring as he started slicing up rolls of cold meat and throwing them onto the platter he was making. This is a lunch. Shizune snapped back. She was delicately cutting the cake into thin slices, arranging each slice neatly on the plate in front of her. That's a dessert. Naruto growled. He was squeezing the mayonnaise bottle as if his life depended on it. And how did you make that so quickly? Shizune smirked. Please. I've been doing this for 2 decades. You've got nothing on me, kid. They both finished up at roughly the same time. Shizune glared at him. From behind his mask, Naruto glared right back. Then, they both grabbed their plates and flew from the room, jumping over the shattered remains of the door. Naruto was in front at first but Shizune darted past him as they turned a corner. Something jabbed him in his ribs and Naruto grunted. Shizune used his distraction to take the lead, a victorious grin on her face. Naruto growled and caught up to her. He yanked on her hair and she shrieked, faltering in her steps. This went on for the next minute, the two apprentices pushing and shoving and tripping each other as they fought to reach the door to the Hokage's office first, each precariously holding onto their tray of food. They turned the last corner, barely avoiding bumping into an administrative officer. Naruto ducked and Shizune sidestepped and raced for the door. Naruto's heart was pumping, his lip curled back and his teeth bared. The adrenaline and rush surged through him as he reached out for the door just as Shizune did. They turned on each other, whacking and slapping and jabbing at each other's debilitating points as they fought to open the door before the other. Then the door opened for them and both Naruto and Shizune fell in. Both assistants cried in unison as they toppled into the Hokage's office, their plates flying up in the air and its contents become dislodged. A moment later the food came crashing down right on top of them. Naruto's mask was blurred as salad, wraps, cake and fruit came smashing down on it. He used a hand to wipe the food off of his face and shook his head dazedly, looking around. A tall, Thin Man stared down at him in bemusement. His head was covered by an elaborate headdress, made of feathers and satin, which had the symbol of the Land of Fire emblazoned on it. He wore a sash of silk and fine cream robes, ornate symbols sewn on up the seams. He loosely held a fan in his right hand and was fanning himself absently. Behind him, Sarutobi had palmed his face and Tsunade was outright laughing. The Fire Lord, ruler of the Land of Fire and perhaps the most politically powerful man in the world, had just watched Uzumaki act like a complete fool. For a single split second, Naruto was completely and utterly mortified. Fool! Sarutobi thundered. Idiot! Tsunade yelled. A thick tome and a silver flask rocketed through the room. The book collided with Naruto's head, the flask with Shizune's, and both apprentices who were struggling to get up slammed back into the ground under the force of the throws. The Fire Lord let out a shrill, noisy giggle and fanned his face majestically. Oh, how amusing, he cried out. How very amusing indeed. Minutes later, a very apologetic apprentice prostrated on the floor feeling very sorry for himself. Tsunade had taken Shizune and left, although Naruto was certain that he had heard her boisterous laughter the moment the door had closed. Above him, Sarutobi and the Fire Lord sat around the Hokage's desk, eyeing the despondent apprentice with varying degrees of amusement. Sarutobi just looked exasperated and grumpy, his eye twitching as he regarded Naruto, who tried desperately to sink into the carpet. Oh, yes, you have a very interesting apprentice, Hiruzen, the Fire Lord exclaimed. His voice was rather high-pitched and it almost had a whiny quality to it. The fan in his hand never seemed to stop moving, either. Oh, yes, very interesting indeed. My apologizes, Sarutobi grunted. He folded his arms and gave Naruto a specific look. He also apologizes. Don't you? I apologize, Daimyo-sama. Naruto repeated quietly. Oh, yes. The Fire Lord chuckled. He's very young indeed. Young and foolish, Sarutobi agreed. Naruto bit his lip, wanting to remind the Hokage that not 10 minutes ago he had been praising Naruto up and down. However, he held his tongue, recognizing the look on the old man's face. It was the look of somebody just looking for an excuse to make a poor, abused aide's life miserable, not out of any specific grievance but because the old bastard thought it was incredibly hilarious. Ferret! Sarutobi barked. For goodness sakes, stop slacking off. Stand up and make some tea for the Fire Lord. Naruto was up in a flash, opening the jar of tea leaves and preparing the tea as the Hokage apologized to the Fire Lord. Not always his fault, the Hokage was saying as Naruto brought over the Fire Lord's tea. I must confess, I have logged an extraordinary large amount of rather heavy items at his head. While his combat skills have not suffered, I do not believe it has done much for his common sense. Naruto ignored the slight as he usually did, at least, as he usually did when the Hokage had company, and carefully lowered the cup of tea to the Fire Lord's face level. He allowed the Fire Lord to see all angles of the cup and then carefully raised it to his face. A small gap opened up on his mask, right near his lips, and Naruto took a careful sip of the tea, making a point of visibly swallowing it in front of the Fire Lord. Oh, yes. The Fire Lord exclaimed as Naruto gently placed the now tasted and tested tea down in front of him. He's been trained well, oh yes, trained well indeed. Naruto bowed his head in thanks and straightened. As he did, he noticed the documents and maps on the Hokage's desk. At the moment, there was a large map of the Land of Fire spread open and a route had been traced out with red ink. On top of that there was a list of provisions donated by the Fire Lord to the village of Konoha, and next to that there was a mission request scroll tied with a crimson ribbon. This observation all happened in a second and Naruto didn't linger as he retreated to his position behind the Hokage and awaited his next orders. I'm glad to see that recovery efforts are going well, oh yes, the Fire Lord mentioned casually, as if he was talking about the weather. It's such a shame about Gyanbaru no Machi, oh yes, such a shame indeed. The Lord of Tea Country is most upset, oh yes, most upset indeed. As are we all, Sarutobi responded gravely. 100,000 lives, men, women, children all taken in a second. I am to understand that the entire city is gone, turned into a smoking crater with very little left. Oh, yes. The Fire Lord agreed. He took a sip of his tea, his face showing his approval. Some were from the Land of Fire, many from Tea Country, oh yes. Including the Lord of Tea Country's favorite niece, oh yes. Such tragedy. We feel for his loss. Naruto didn't know if the Hokage was being a tad sardonic right there, but he certainly sounded sincere. I expect many angry letters from him. Oh yes, the Fire Lord continued. He fanned himself idly. If only you'd left some of the enemy alive. Oh yes. But the Lord of Tea Country has nobody to take his anger out on. Oh yes, nobody indeed. So I, of course, will take that burden. I apologize for the efficiency of our counterattack. Sarutobi's voice was definitely dry at that point. However, I felt it was best that we remove the threat to the Land of Fire as soon as possible. Oh, yes. The Fire Lord exclaimed. You did well. Oh yes, exceptionally well indeed. He hid half of his face behind his fad and giggled. In fact, was it not your exceptional apprentice that led the team that stopped that madman from destroying this village? Sarutobi nodded gravely as Naruto straightened. Yes, it was, the Hokage answered quietly. He performed exceedingly well given the circumstances. The loss of Gyanbaru no Machi was tragic, however, the situation could have been extremely worse. Every capital and every hidden could easily have been destroyed in a single day. A powerful weapon, the Fire Lord said quietly. He fanned himself. Oh, yes, a powerful weapon indeed. He brightened. But we are forgetting something. You, Anbu. He pointed at Naruto with his fan. You have the gratitude of the Land of Fire and the personal thanks of its Lord. Should you ever desire a reward, you only need to ask and I will provide it for you, such is my generosity. Oh, yes. My thanks, Daimyo-sama, Naruto said gravely. I was merely doing my duty. Oh yes, of course. The Fire Lord giggled shrilly. However, good work should be rewarded. Oh yes, it should. My reward stands. Naruto hesitated and then bowed his head silently. It was hard to tell what the Hokage was thinking, but there had been a flash of emotion behind his usually hard eyes, something fierce but fleeting. The Fire Lord snapped his fan shut and slapped it on his palm. Now, we must talk business. The Fire Lord cried. I have begun raising fines to help assist you in your repairs. Oh, yes. My son is levying the nobles back at the capital while my daughter has gone on a tour of sorts. He made a face. A tour, oh yes, something to inspire goodwill and motivate the nobles who live in the further regions. That is excellent to hear, Sarutobi said quietly. Tell me, Hiruzen, what do you need? The Fire Lord opened his fan and began fanning himself again for no particular reason. After all, I cannot have my hidden village in ruins. Sarutobi motioned at Naruto and he left his spot behind the Hokage. He walked to some of the completed paperwork and picked up a pile of papers. He dropped them on the desk in front of Sarutobi, who took the first sheet off the top of the pile and handed it to the Fire Lord. Dismissed, Ferret, Sarutobi ordered. Go and clean yourself up. Hokage-sama, Daimyo-sama, Naruto said with a bow. He was glad to get out of that room. After spending over half of his life putting up with the Hokage's exaggerated tantrums and false moods, Naruto had developed a keen sense of when somebody was acting less than truthfully. With the Fire Lord, despite all of his eccentric mannerisms and quirky speech patterns, Naruto hadn't been able to get a read on him at all. He was glad to get out of that room and away from the eyes that had barely left him. The next couple of days were extremely awkward for Naruto. The Fire Lord, as a show of trust and respect for the village hidden in leaves, had planned an extended week's stay in the village. A full contingent of samurai had been stationed outside the village walls, mostly a symbolic gesture than anything else, and the Fire Lord's personal guard had arrived. Wearing thick red sashes with the unique symbol of the 12 Guardians, these elite shinobi apparently trusted nobody. There were 6 in Konoha at the moment and 3 never left the Fire Lord's side. Despite Naruto's role as the Hokage's aide, they had expressly forbidden him to be within the Fire Lord's proximity without the Hokage's presence. Naruto would have taken it personally, except that the rule apparently applied to all shinobi. It made the completion of his duties hard when the Fire Lord was touring the Hokage's tower or wandering about curiously, and there had been several times when Naruto had been kicked out of the tower. There was no use protesting and, honestly, he was glad to have an excuse to stay away from the Fire Lord. The unknown gleam in his eye whenever he encountered Naruto was disturbing, and the poor boy briefly wondered if the Fire Lord had those sorts of tendencies. He was working at the mission assignment desk, sorting out the different repair orders for the squads of genin that were scurrying about assisting with the rebuilding when the Anbu came for him. A flicker of movement caught his attention as a single Anbu member appeared in the office, a dog mask on his face. Ferret. The ANBU's voice was emotionless. You have been summoned for a mission. Report to the briefing room. There was the authenticity pulse through his tattoo and Naruto nodded. The Anbu member disappeared in a flicker of movement while Naruto put away the last of the scrolls and closed the filing cabinet. Then, he made a handing and disappeared in a body flicker. A little while later, he stepped into the headquarters for the Anbu. The entrance to Anbu headquarters was located on the bottom level of Hokage's tower and the facility itself extended underneath Konoha towards the Hokage's monument. Several facilities called these catacombs home the Torture and Interrogation Department, the Advanced Research and Developments Office and the General Intelligence Services Agency. Naruto's tattoo pulsed with chakra on his arm as he confirmed the correct passcodes and was granted access. Although he couldn't see them, he knew a full combat platoon guarded the entrance to these restricted areas at all times. He walked through the hallways, his footsteps echoing loudly in the deserted corridors. The genjutsu barriers were effective in cases of intrusion. Only those who knew the correct route through them could pass them, otherwise infiltrators could spend days wandering the corridors without getting anywhere. He opened a seemingly random door and entered yet another dull and bland corridor. This time, it was a real one and occasionally he would pass another Anbu operative. Some of them nodded respectfully at him, others ignored him completely. There were some whose faces he knew and there were others who were completely unknown to him. The Anbu were the Hokage's personal army. They conducted military operations, both domestically and internationally. They were the soldiers of Konoha, whereas other shinobi were the workforce of Konoha. The Anbu fought the enemy to protect Konoha and her interests. Shinobi fought the enemy to complete missions and make money for Konoha. That was really the only distinction between the two. Anbu would be sent on missions that generally had nothing to do with money while shinobi were more mercenary. As such, there was a higher level of confidentiality required within the Anbu, for security and safety purposes. The identities of most Anbu were generally not classified. In many cases, the use of Anbu mask was partly tradition but mostly practicality. Many benefits came from wearing one, but the cost and labor spent making one meant that they were hardly ideal for mass production. The identities of those beneath the masks were not secret and the families and friends of many Anbu members knew exactly where they worked. For the most part, this was true. The exception was Konoha's two assassination teams and Konoha's first combat platoon Alpha Team. Alpha Team was the Hokage's most elite squad and were the exception to the rule. If you joined Alpha Squad, you never left. Their identities were hidden and classified to all but the Hokage. They were the most elite. They were the most dangerous. As Naruto passed a member of Alpha Squadron, he silently reiterated his opinion that they were also the ones with the biggest sticks up their ass. He shook his head, rolling his eyes, as he strode through the corridor and approached the mission room. He entered and saluted the Anbu commander, who stood behind a table waiting. Several other robed and masked figures stood around it and Naruto stepped forward to join the former members of Sigma Squad. Naruto had been the sole member of the Hokage's personal squad, and that squad had only been expanded due to a clause in the wartime conditions policy. After the alert level for Konoha had been lowered, each member of Sigma Squad had been reassigned back to their original squads. The last he heard, Anbu HQ was still trying to sort out the mess that Gamma Team had become and he hadn't heard anything about Kage's recon squad. Good. We can begin. The Anbu commander was nothing if not to the point. He gestured to the desk, pointing at a map of Konoha. There have been reports of raids and attacks in these areas here. He pointed to the region along the northeast border of the Land of Fire. We assumed they were criminals and dispatched a special Jonin and a team of Chunin for a simple policing job. They have not reported in. Naruto frowned. Intel suggests that a noble has now disappeared on his way back to his villa. The Fire Lord feels very strongly about this sort of thing, so we're sending you out to find out what's going on. The commander pointed at Kage. Kage, your recon team has point on this. Komaki, you will take what's left of Gamma Team's third squad and support him. Ferret is still attached to your unit and will join you. Find out what's going on. If it's a serious incursion, we'll send additional firepower. If not, fix the problem yourself. Questions? Nobody spoke. Naruto couldn't help the grin behind his mask as he swiveled his eyes, taking in the sight of his comrades. He would enjoy working with them again. A warning, the Fire Lord may have already hired a team of bounty hunters to the scene already. If he has, do not engage them unless they engage you first. He may have hired Kumo to make a point to Konoha, and I do not want you starting a war with them. Understood, sir. They all chorused. Dismissed. The newly formed Team Cage filed out. The moment the door closed, Yuka was on him, mussing his hair affectionately. Captain Cutie. She squealed. She paused. Well, not Captain, but still. Cutie. Geroff. Naruto growled, although something lurched in his stomach and his protests and struggles weren't that sincere. It's good to work together again, Cage, Komaki said to Cage. Hey, boss. Daichi greeted. He paused. Ex-boss. Hey, you're all my boss. Everybody's my boss. Team. Cage didn't speak very loudly, but when he did, everybody fell silent and listened. Gather your equipment. We leave from Mission Gate 4 in 30 minutes. Team Cage left Konoha and traveled northeast, towards the borders between the Land of Fire and the lands of Rice and Hot Water. This part of the Land of Fire was perhaps the least inhabited, and there was still an almost untamable quality to the area. Long ago, before the founding of the hidden villages, the infamous Senju clan had called these lands home. It had been a dangerous place for somebody not affiliated with the clan to travel, and many people have simply disappeared within the Senju borders, never to be heard from again. In time, the mystique died and some settlers did venture into the lands, joining the remnants of the Senju clan who had remained in their ancestral homes. Together, they carved themselves a niche in the industrial sector. Whether it was due to the powers of the first Hokage, or perhaps a Senju in the long-forgotten past had also possessed the notorious wood release techniques, but the trees in this part of the Land of Fire were different. Some would say that they were sentient, aware of the coming and goings of those around them. The villages and towns in the area didn't seem to think so and made their living in the lumber industry. The wood here was highly prized, very sturdy and in high demand in all parts of the world. Initially, there had been some concern that sacred trees of the Senju would all disappear. Early on, though, the lumberjacks had discovered that the stumps of the trees they had felled would relatively quickly regenerate, and within the span of a few years another tree would have taken its place, as tall as any of its brethren. It made the lumber industry extremely profitable, cutting down on costs, and they used the rivers in the area to transport the lumber to other parts of the Land of Fire. Given the mystique of the area held by much of the common populace, the region was relatively quiet. War had not touched the land there since the time of the warring clans. Any hostilities between Kumo and Konoha had taken place in the bordering countries between them, the Land of Rice, the Land of Hot Water and the Land of Frost. This had not endeared the great villages to the populations in those areas, but some would argue that it was a worthwhile sacrifice. As the area was relatively peaceful, there wasn't actually a large shinobi presence. There was a battalion of Leaf Nin located on the border between the Land of Hot Water and the Land of Fire, and a few scattered Chunin police squads in the region, but that was about it. Occasionally, outlaws or bandits did try to intercept traveling merchants and supply caravans, but lumber was a hard commodity to smuggle and many thought that it wasn't really worth the effort. Team Cage consisted of the remnants of Recon Squad Iota and Gamma Team's 3rd Squad. Naruto was still officially attached to Gamma Team and had joined Jonin Komaki, Chunin Toa, Chunin Yuka and Chunin Daichi in this mission, all under the command of Jonin Captain Cage. For the first few hours, Team Cage patrolled the border, flying through the trees. Cage, Daichi and Yuka were in their elements here as they occasionally stopped to look at tracks and signs that Naruto hadn't even noticed. Komaki and Toa also looked out of their elements as well. They were combat specialists, not trackers. It was several hours into their patrol and Cage had taken them closer to where one of the attacks had reportedly occurred, just 15 minutes outside the nearest town. The Anbu leaped from branch to branch, Cage in the lead, and came to a halt when the captain raised his hand. Naruto, who had taken position at the back, watched as Cage cocked his head. A minute went by as the Anbu squad waited patiently. "Listen," murmured Cage, his voice barely audible. "Do you hear anything?" Komaki, his second in command for this mission, tilted her head. Naruto frowned underneath his mask, straining his senses to the maximum. He closed his eyes and allowed the sounds of the world around them to drift into his ears. He could hear birds chirp, the wind rustling leaves, the faint cries of distant animals and the chirp and buzz of insects. His own heartbeat filled his ears, the rising and falling of his breath quite noisy when he was still. Yet, from all of that nothing unusual struck his senses. Komaki evidently thought so too because she shook her. "I hear nothing unordinary," she answered quietly. Cage nodded. Yes, he agreed. Nothing unusual. Yet, Katsura village is located only 15 minutes west of our position. It's a small village that produces a great deal of lumber. During this time of the day and this time of the year, there should be men all throughout these forests working. There's no sound of human activity, Komaki said with dawning comprehension. Naruto listened again. Cage was right. He couldn't hear anybody speaking near them at all. There were no distant thuds as axes thumped into trees. There were no soaring noises as workmen processed the fallen trunks. No chatter, no laughter, no nothing. Cage sniffed the air. Yet, there is a smell, he fell silent, pondering. We're going to divert off our path for a few moments. The rest of the team acknowledged Cage's instructions and together they bounded towards Katsura village. Katsura village was a rather small village located in the inner depths of the Land of Fire. Surrounded by dense foliage, thick trees towered over it, doing a very good job of hiding it from aerial view. As they approached the village, Naruto saw that it was quite undefended. There were no walls or gates. It was an open village, made primarily from timber and wood. The roofs of the houses were made from the thick bundles of leaves from the forest and must have done an adequate job of keeping the water out. The biggest structure in the village was at the other end, a large rectangular building that had been built next to the flowing river. The river pushed a water wheel, which must have turned something inside the factory. It looked like a nice, quiet village. Yet, the closer they became, the more and more Naruto tensed. Cage had been right. There were no sounds of human activity coming from ahead of them at all. They had passed a worksite a few minutes ago and it had been completely deserted, as if nobody had shown up for work. No smoke rose from the chimneys of the factories and nothing around the houses seemed to move. Team Cage approached the village at good speed and leapt from the edge of the tree line. They landed in a crouch on the cobbled road that led into the village and rose. The village ahead of them was silent. Nothing moved. Cage's hands flashed and Naruto inclined his head in agreement. Although the sun was shining rather nicely down on him, he shivered as he passed the boundary and entered the village. The team split up and Naruto walked forwards, his footsteps silent. The houses lined up neatly around him, looking undamaged and untouched as far as Naruto could tell, but many of the front doors had been left open, rocking and creaking as the wind blew through the ghost town. Naruto clenched his hands, his heart beating quickly, and approached one of the houses. Despite the lack of an immediate threat, his hand slipped into his cloak and he pulled out a kunai. He also noted the positions of several objects suitable for the replacement technique, before he took a deep breath and entered the house. It was the house of somebody who tried very hard to keep it clean despite the age and cluttered nature of the house. It was a small home, with only 4 rooms. Naruto had walked into the kitchen and he stared at the dinner table. There were 5 seats, 2 large seats at both ends of the table, 2 smaller seats on the sides and one that had been clearly raised up for a small child. Dinner plates and tin cups had been left uneaten. There was a chopstick on one of the plates that had speared a piece of meat and then dropped, as if the entire family had decided that they weren't hungry at the exact moment. Naruto bent down and placed a gloved finger in one of the dinners. It was cold. He pulled it out and carefully wiped it on the faded green patterned tablecloth. The sun shone in from the kitchen windows as the blonde Anbu decided to inspect the other rooms. They were much the same. The beds hadn't been slept in and were still neatly made and tucked in. In the main bedroom, he saw a bundle of muddied and soiled clothes, large, big enough for a man. His eyes also tracked down and saw a pair of thick, rubber boots, and an axe leaning on the doorframe. The worker had come home. He had gotten change out of his work clothes, expecting his wife to wash them for him. He had started dinner with his entire family. Then, they had all left and vanished. He searched the rest of the house for any more clues, pausing briefly in the smallest bedroom and staring at a fluffy white teddy. It stared back at him with dull black eyes, a grin sewn onto its face, and Naruto quietly closed the door. He made a cursory inspection of everything else but nothing else jumped out to him, so he left leaving the front door open exactly the way he had found it. The wind flew into the village and the wooden creaked. Naruto continued his search for the next few minutes and met up with the rest of his squad at the end of the street. "Report," commanded Cage, his voice barely a whisper. "There was a disturbance at the village stables," Daichi murmured. The soil was disturbed and the wood had been chipped near the stalls. The horses seemed to have taken the doors out and bolted. Daichi's report was the only one of substance. The rest reported what Naruto had already seen. The occupants of the village had come home from work. Dinner had been made, kids had been brought in from outside. Then, for no discernible reason, everything had been left exactly where it was and the population had vanished. Naruto finished his report and waited for Kage to speak. He felt tense. The eerie atmosphere of this silent village was beginning to get to him. Could it be poison? Kage asked Yuka quietly. Maybe, the Yamanaka replied softly. It would have had to be distributed in an instant and affect the entire village at exactly the same time. It might have been airborne. It would have needed to be extremely potent, causing immediate symptoms. I haven't detected any poisons in the air, so it's possible it broke down after a short period of time. But, there are two problems. Kage nodded at her to continue. There's no indication that bodies had fallen on the ground, Yuka said quietly. Nothing was knocked over or disturbed. It might have caused immediate paralysis, but on this scale. And there are no bodies, Daichi finished for her grimly. I've used my Byakugan to scan the village. I can't detect any chakra signs at all. Are there toxins that can dissolve corpses? Komaki asked. Some, Yuka answered, but she shook her head. But not like this. There's usually something left over. Puddles, dust, grit. There's nothing here. Kage was kneeling down, examining something in the dust. He traced it with his gloved hand and stood back up. I saw a lot of tracks coming from every home, he murmured. Multiple people, all leaving at about the same time and heading towards the other side of the village. Orders, sir? Naruto asked quietly. Personally, he wanted to get the hell out of this strange village. Continue searching for survivors, Kage commanded after a few moments. He brushed the dust off of his cloak. We'll split up and cover each area of the village. After 10 minutes, converge on the entrance to the factory. The Anbu nodded grimly. Kage had said, survivors. They were now acting under the assumption that the village had been attacked in some way. They disappeared in a flash of movement. Naruto began his search of the village in a small patch of grass at the edge of the village. Somebody had attempted to put up a fence at one point, but grass and plants had quickly overtaken it, the forest working hard to reclaim the stolen land. Nonetheless, somebody had taken good care of the park. 4 longs had been arranged in the middle and a pile of sand had been dropped into it. The grass was trimmed neatly and a children's playground had been set up. Naruto passed the sandpit and eyed the children's toys on top of it grimly. The cheap, plastic, Iwa-made shovel and bucket had been in use when the incident had occurred. He could imagine a small child digging into the sand, filling the bucket and then stopping the spade still half full as the child. Well, he didn't know what had happened. He moved on, past the sandpit and to the park benches. A book had been dropped on the group, its pages flipping in the wind, and a pram lay unattended next to it. A bright-faced doll, 2 red circles for cheeks, grinned up at him happily, its blank eyes gazing unseeingly into the sky. Naruto carefully bent down and inspected the inside of the pram. He found a crumpled bag and a small bottle of souring milk, left unattended like everything else, but the baby was gone. His eyes caught sight of bright pink threads lining the pram and he frowned. The parent had been able to pick the baby up, who had probably still been wrapped in the blanket, as the incident was occurring. The more Naruto saw, the more he became convinced that it hadn't been a poison attack. The strongest poisons could be found in the Land of Wind, produced by Suna for their shinobi, but nothing he had ever heard of could have caused something like this. There was a dark feeling in the air as Naruto stood up again. He surveyed the area carefully, almost nervously. His sensor abilities weren't amazing, but they were adequate in small areas, yet he couldn't feel a single shred of chakra around him. Still, there was something unpleasant lingering in the air, something that weighed down on his shoulders. He continued to inspect the village, moving past the park and further into the dead town. Doors lay open, streets unused and fires long burned out. There was a fountain further up ahead, still operating and shooting a gentle spray of water up into the air. A cart lay unattended in the middle of the road, full of dirty workers' gear and sharp axes, while something howled and jumped at him. Naruto jerked back, his chakra flaring as he instinctively used the replacement technique. His body felt like it was being squeezed as the space around his body warped, an almost instantaneous swap happening with one of the large crates on the unattended cart. He crouched, his kunai whipping into his hand as he tried to get a good look at his attack. The wooden box splintered as whatever it was pushed it away and lunged towards Naruto. Its movements were slow to a shinobi, and the young Anbu dodged a wild, feral swing and swung his leg up. The attacker let out a grunt as Naruto kneed it in the stomach, bringing the handle of his kunai up and slamming it into the attacker's cheek. With a skittish howl, the creature drew back and the blonde finally got a good look at his attacker. It was a man, emancipated and greasy. What Naruto thought had been fur at first was actually filth, covering almost every inch of his body. His eyes were wild, his mouth frothing, and blood seemed to drip from every inch of his exposed body. The rags he wore clung to his body and he snarled wordlessly at Naruto, readying for another lunge. Naruto made a hand sign, his chakra flaring, and abruptly the feral man shrieked, his arms coming up as if Naruto had struck him. Then, he turned and bolted away like a madman, howling madly into the air. Naruto, his hands still formed in a hand seal, watched him go, his heart beating madly as adrenaline coursed through his veins. Shit, he gasped, the shock of the encounter wearing off. The man's howls ran throughout the village as Naruto formed a seal and thrust his arm up in the air. Lightning release. Lightning signal flare. A bolt of electricity discharged into the air, lighting up the sky as it exploded. A good user of this technique could change the specific way that the technique exploded, and Naruto formed the Anbu symbol for rendezvous, and waited. After a few minutes, the rest of Team Cage began to converge on his position. Naruto's hands flashed in code and they formed a defensive perimeter until the rest of the squad had reached their position. Status. Single enemy contact, male, unknown age, moving west. Daichi frowned, his head rising and peering in that direction. He gave a slight shake, indicating that his Byakugan couldn't see anything. Nonetheless, Cage gave the silent command to form up and Team Cage began to follow the path that the feral man had left. They rose to the rooftops in a defensive formation, Cage and Daichi at the front and rear ends, Komaki and Toa right behind them, and Yuka and Naruto side by side, a flexible formation that allowed them counter and attack from all directions. There was no sign of the man, but it seemed like he had been heading for the large factory. After they had reached a certain distance, Daichi suddenly raised his hand and the group halted. Cage turned his head, his two glowing eyes shining brightly behind the artificial darkness of his hood, and nodded as Daichi silently requested to speak. There's something unusual about the factor, the Hyuga murmured. I thought it was just empty, but it's not even registering on my Byakugan. It's a big black spot that I wouldn't even have noticed if I hadn't been looking at it. Chakra sources? Cage asked. None. Daichi made a strange noise. But there's something there. I can see a mist of, he struggled to explain it. It's a mist of nothingness, I suppose, the absence of anything. It's leaking from the building, blocking out everything behind it. Naruto peered at the looming factory. He couldn't see anything, but he trusted the eyes of a Hyuga. Cage took this into consideration and the squad advanced, jumping on rooftops and making their way to the factory. As they reached the entrance, they halted and Naruto took in a deep breath. There, on the large metal doors, an archaic symbol had been drawn with a thick crimson liquid that Naruto instinctively knew was not paint. There was a lot of it, two more blood than one person would have been capable of donating. The shutters on all of the windows were down and there was a strange chill in the air, causing the skin on Naruto's arms to prickle. Something inside of me is screaming not to enter that place, Komaki murmured. The squad had unconsciously drawn closer together, their shoulders pressed against each other like rookie genin. Cage stood at the front, surveying the factory quietly. I don't think we're going to like what we find, Toa said grimly. Cage's fingers blurred. Defensive formation, recon team top window, combat team main entrance, care for traps. Daichi and Yuka leaped forward and began climbing up the vertical wall of the factor, Cage in the lead, while Komaki raised an arm and signaled Naruto and Toa to take formation. Together, they walked to the bloody door and entered the desolate factory. Outside of the factory walls, Katsura village had been virtually intact. There had been no signs of a struggle. The buildings had not been damaged or destroyed. There had been no signs of violence. Within those four factory walls, Team Cage had descended into a kind of hell that none of them had ever encountered before. The first indication that something was terribly wrong was when they had opened the door and two things had seeped out from the inside. The first had been a veritable river of blood, the crimson liquid oozing over their feet and pushing against the door. Naruto had instinctively applied chakra and watched with a sort of horrified detachment as the blood flowed out of the factory. Then the second thing had struck them all at once, a terrible, overpowering stench of death. It filled his nostrils, threatening to make him gag, and he was only just able to activate the mask's filters before he was sick. The buzz of flies filled his ears as Toa pushed the door open, past the river of blood, and then stood back with the rest of his team. Despite all their training and emotional conditioning, each Anbu member hesitated. None of them wanted to go inside because they knew exactly what they were going to find. Komaki recovered the quickest and gestured forward. Naruto and Toa reluctantly obeyed, stepping inside the darkened factory. The door slowly creaked shut behind them, cutting off all of the light. The loud buzz of flies filled the air, intermingled with the harsh breathing from all three Anbu. The floor was sticky and wet. The three shinobi were pressed up against each other, grateful for the body warmth that they produced that fought against the unnatural coldness that lingered in the air around them. Naruto didn't want to turn on his enhanced vision features of his mask. He really didn't want to. He did, and Hell greeted him, leering at him with broken teeth and hollow eye sockets. Naruto flinched, his breath shortening, and he staggered back until his back was pressed against the door. The corpse grinned maniacally at him from its spot at the entrance to the foyer, crucified against the wall. Its body was missing large chunks of flesh and its skin had been peeled off. Blood, urine, fecal matter and all kinds of body matter clung to it. Many of its bones were visibly exposed and its nose had been torn clean off its face. It was the most horrible thing Naruto had ever seen. He had thought the Sky Nins had been horrible as they burned their way through the southern regions of the Land of Fire. But their torture and murder of the inhabitants of those helpless towns was nothing to what was inside that factory. Naruto, Komaki and Toa had stepped inside the factory and into the entrance lobby. It was hard to tell what features it had had before. The floor was literally overflowing with blood and symbols of all sorts had been drawn on the walls with surprising care. There were no other bodies within visual range, but the buzz of the flies only grew louder as they looked past the first crucified victim at a set of double doors which lead to the factory floor. Naruto swallowed and embraced his emotional conditioning. His mind became strangely calm as he forced the horror of what he seen down into the very recesses of his mind. With a deep breath, he gently bumped Toa and Komaki. The two turned to him as Naruto gestured silently at the door. Then, somewhat breaking protocol, Naruto took the lead and allowed Komaki and Toa to follow him. He reached out with a gloved hand and gently pushed the doors open. There were mountains of bodies twisted, disfigured, deformed. Men, women and children had been thrown into piles, blood flowing down them towards the entrance lobby. From what remained of many of the faces Naruto could see, they had not died well. Their faces were twisted into eternal expressions of agony, signifies that their last moments had been squeezed horribly out of them. Beyond the mountains of corpses, bodies had been pinned up on the walls, arms splayed out and bolted down with thick metal spikes. Blood dripped from these corpses as well, or what was left of them. Many of them were not in one piece, some with only a head and a meaty limbless husk for a body. Strangely enough, every body Naruto could see had a head. He caught movement in his eye and froze, his eyes swinging up. It was Kage, leading Daichi and Yuka up above them on one of the metal walkways that crisscrossed over the factory floor. Bodies had been pinned up against the ceiling, arranged around that same symbol that had been splattered over the factory doors, a perfect circle with an upside-down triangle fitting in it. His tattoo pulsed and Naruto sent a pulse back, silently gliding over the blood and past a pile of hacked-off limbs. The closer he got the bodies, the more he saw how horrible, mutilated and tortured these poor people had been. In one case, the enemy had torn off the flesh off the poor boy's torso and carved symbols into his very bones. The sheer look of agony on the corpse's face made Naruto shiver. He looked like he had been alive when it had happened. The deeper they walked into the mass grave, the denser the flies got. They were everywhere, drawn in from miles away by the smell of death, and hovered over and in the bodies without care. They stayed away from the Anbu group, content with the meal they already had. He was so very glad that his mask had filters on, he really was. Komaki and Toa strode behind him, each taking in the horrifying sights around them with forced detachment. It was carnage, the worst kind of carnage that Naruto could have possibly ever imagined. Kage, Daichi and Yuka leapt off the rails and landed down silently in front of Naruto. Yuka and Daichi had that air of forced detachment around them, but Kage was as enigmatic as ever, looming over the piles of tortured bodies, the two little white lights that represented his eyes glowing soullessly. Their squad captain knelt down by the nearest body and began inspecting it as the rest of the team formed a loose formation around him. Naruto saw Toa staring at the agonized expression of a small boy, no older than 5, as if he was unable to look away. He only reacted when Komaki touched him on the shoulder, jerking back as his head flew around, and then he patted her hand softly. Both Daichi and Yuka had drifted closer to Naruto, the two exchanging lingering touches as if to reassure each other that they were still there. Naruto gestured at Daichi. "Watch for incoming," he signed, and Daichi nodded. Although he couldn't see the bulging veins around his eyes, he knew that were there as Daichi became still, seeing all around them probably with perfect clarity. The Byakugan was possibly the second worst bloodline to possess around living nightmares like this, the first being the Sharingan. He couldn't imagine having these images seared into his head for the rest of his life, unable to forget. Kage stood up from the body and led the team deeper into the factory. Ritualistic symbols had been drawn everywhere. Naruto didn't like looking at them. They seemed fine at first and they had been drawn with care. It was definitely more preferably examining the sigils than it was the bodies. But the longer he looked at them, the more it seemed like they were moving, blood oozing against the power of gravity and squirming in the confines of the symbol. Yet, when he looked away and focused his attention somewhere else, he could always see them at the edge of his peripheral vision, something deep within his psyche recognizing them as a threat to be watched. His breathing was harsh to his ears as Kage stopped, eyeing the bodies all around him. Their cloaks were blood-free, the liquid flowed off it as water did on oily surfaces. Kage reached into his cloak and pulled out a small book. He consulted it for a few moments. Total population 714, Kage signed. Naruto looked around grimly. That seemed around right. There was no sign of the mysterious attacker as they came to the center of the factory floor. Here, makeshift barricades had been placed up and many bodies lay on the ground. These were different, they had relatively normal inflicted wounds one might receive in battle. Naruto eyed the shovel held the hands of a corpse and the axe buried in that same corpse's chest. They have fought each other. His eyes raked over the battlefield, pausing briefly on the middle-aged woman who still had her hands wrapped around a child's throat. The little girl's face was blue, her wide green eyes frozen with terror and horror and betrayal. The resemblance between the girl and her attacked was too much, and for a moment Naruto's mental stability threatened to collapse. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, and steadied himself. Something was brewing in the deep, dark parts of his stomach. Embers were being stoked, a terrible fire beginning to crackle and burn. Naruto embraced the feeling, his fists clenched tightly. Kage bent down on some of the corpses. He examined them as Naruto looked away, the young, blonde Anbu not wanting to risk threatening the mission with an emotional outburst. Kage stood, his fingers flashing. Flesh underneath the fingernails. Factory tools used as weapons. Free-for-all struggle, the silent captain signed. Cause amusement for the enemy. As Naruto stared at the makeshift barricades and the walkways around and above them, he could just imagine their faceless enemy watching from above as the civilians fought each other to the death. The woman had been willing to strangle her own daughter to comply with whatever the enemy had wanted. Perhaps they had been promised freedom, or guaranteed that they would be spared, lies said as their friends, families and people they knew were butchered all around them. There was a loud clang and the Anbu squad stiffened. They formed around each other, standing in the middle of the arena, backs together. Kage kept his head straight as he whispered very quietly. Daichi. Negative, the Hyuga breathed. I want him alive, Kage said emotionlessly. There was a flicker of movement from the shadows. Naruto tensed and watched, his eyes peering past the mountain of bodies and into there. The same feral man jumped out, screaming and wailing as he had before. He had a logger's hand axe in his hand, waving it about madly as he charged at them. It was an unfair fight. Naruto simply moved forward, ducked underneath he first wild spin and delivered a solid uppercut into the other man's gut. The feral man wheezed and Komaki moved, senbon and wire whipping through the air as she bound the man together in an elaborate rope of metal. The man ranted and screamed and wailed, driving away the deathly silence in the air as the Anbu squad surrounded him. There's no chakra in him. Daichi said. His voice was faint. It's impossible, but it's true. There's not a single shred of chakra in him at all, just that blankness. Yuka. Kage only said her name and the Yamanaka nodded. She seemed reluctant as she approached the prisoner and placed both hands on the side of his head. At her touch, the man stilled and Yuka froze. It lasted a few moments and the last echoes of the man's screams faded away. The silence returned. It didn't last long. With a sudden scream, Yuka's hands flew away from the man's head as if it was on fire and she staggered away. She was bent over, almost gasping, and managed to take off her mask before she was sick all over the floor. Naruto was there instantly, patting her gently on the back as she took deep breaths of air. What did you see? Kage asked quietly, waiting a few moments so that the Yamanaka had time to recover. Not much, she answered. She was still breathing hard, but her voice had taken on a dead tone, flat and uncaring. His mind is a mess. There's not much left of him, he's almost gone, almost one of them. Who? Kage asked urgently. I don't know, Yuka answered. She gestured at the now flailing and crying man. He didn't know either. He was eating dinner when they all stood and walked here. It was as if something had compelled them to come here. When they got here, there were robed men, I don't know how many, maybe 10. Maybe more. Despite her tone, she seemed reluctant to go on and Naruto squeezed her shoulder. They spent the entire night torturing him, Yuka continued quietly. Most of them just stood there, waiting for their turn. They tied him up, she gestured at the bound captive, and made him watch. They forced his family to fight in the arena. His wife used their baby as a club to beat their son to death. They gave him a knife and showed him how to carve his skin, to praise the god. She struggled to find the word. Then, Kage pressed. Then they left, Yuka finished softly. She held her hand to her head, her eyes fluttering shut in concentration. That man there, he thanked them for the gift and wished them luck. Kage was motionless. The twinkling dots behind his hood seemed to be growing brighter. Will we get any more information from him? No. Yuka sounded certain. Kage nodded. Then, he raised his dull black machete and ended their captive's suffering with a single swipe. Come, he ordered. Let's get out of here. In the following hour, the Anbu secured Katsura village. Naruto had summoned a messenger and sent a message to the Hokage, asking for immediate reinforcements for the region. Komaki had drawn a few sketches, tracing the symbols very carefully and briefly drawing some of the bodies they had recovered, and Naruto had sent them too. The entire squad was somber and quiet. Yuka had donned her mask again and had gone silent. She didn't speak and spent a lot of the time seemingly staring at nothing. Naruto could see her emotional conditioning at work, completely repressing her emotions and memories. When she did speak, her voice was monotone but she sounded oddly distracted at times. It was the curse of the Yamanaka. Kage had secured the perimeter of the town and the squad formed up around him. There are tracks heading north, he told them grimly. They left sometime this morning, after they were done here. There's another town not far from here. 400 citizens. The implication was not lost on them. It's possible that this cult is the one responsible for the disappearances, Kage said. As such, we will pursue. They've gotten ballsy, Daichi murmured. Going from picking off some travelers to wiping out entire towns. The Sky Blitz may have provided them with the opportunity they were looking for. Kage sounded like he had been thinking about this a lot. Konoha is distracted. The Fire Lord's eyes are south. They packed up their equipment and prepared for departure. Naruto had reached into his pack and pulled out a flare. He aimed it at the sky and fired it. It flew high up into the air and exploded in a shower of crimson sparks, a glowing ball of light hovering in the air. It would stay there for some time, the code red symbol warning for all those who saw it not to approach. Hopefully reinforcements would be there within a matter of hours. Kage nodded at Naruto. Although the young Anbu had never really seen Kage show any strong emotion, ever since leaving the factory there had been a deadly stillness to every movement he made. Naruto knew that, in his way, Kage was furious, and he nodded back at his captain seriously. They would find out who was doing this and then they would put a stop to it permanently. That will be it for this video. If you want more, comment down below, like, subscribe. And see you guys later.